The first time my father ever asked me for anything, I was 11 years old and he needed help carrying a bookshelf up the stairs. The last time he asked me for anything, I was 61, and it cost me my marriage. That's not an exaggeration. That's just how the story ends, so I might as well tell you how it starts. My name is Frank Delacroix. I'm 62 years old. I've spent 30 years fixing furnaces and boilers across 3 counties in western Pennsylvania, and I have been the kind of husband who thought silence was the same thing as peace. I was wrong about that for a long time. It took my father, of all people, at 86 years old, to show me exactly how wrong. My dad, Walter Delacroix, was not a man who talked about love. He was a man who showed it. In the particular language of his generation, a language made of casseroles left on porches, of shoveled driveways before anyone woke up, of a hand on your shoulder instead of a hug, because a hand on the shoulder was what men like him knew how to give. He raised me alone after my mother passed when I was 9, worked 2 jobs without ever once telling me it was hard, and put a roof over my head that never once leaked, not in 50 years, because he'd reshingled it himself 3 times. When his knees finally gave out 2 years ago and he had to move into assisted living at Willow Creek, 20 minutes from my house, he never complained. Not once. He'd call me every Sunday at exactly 4 o'clock, like clockwork, just to ask how the Steelers were doing and whether I'd fixed the leak in Mrs. Pemberton's water heater on Route 9. Small talk. That was Dad. He never called to say he needed something. In 2 years at Willow Creek, he called for help exactly 1 time before the day I'm about to tell you about. And it wasn't even really a call. It was a text, sent from his flip phone, that just said, "Need new batteries for the remote. No rush." That was the extent of Walter Delacroix asking for things. So, understand what it meant when my phone rang at 6:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, and it was Willow Creek's front desk, and not my father. Welcome to whatever this channel of mine has become, a place where I tell you what actually happened to me, plainly, without embellishing it, because the truth doesn't need any help standing up straight. If you're new here, stick around. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. Hit subscribe if this is the kind of thing you come back for. Now let me tell you about the worst Tuesday of my life, and the best decision my father ever made. The woman on the phone was named Denise, one of the overnight aides, and her voice had that careful, practiced calm that people use when they're trying not to alarm you while telling you something alarming. "Mr. Delacroix, I don't want you to panic, but your father had a fall overnight, and he's having some pain in his hip and some confusion that's concerning our on-call nurse. We think it's best if he goes to the ER to get checked, and normally we'd call an ambulance, but he's asking for you specifically. He's saying your name." I was already out of bed before she finished the sentence. Standing in the kitchen in yesterday's socks, feeling the cold linoleum through the thin cotton, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went pale. "Is he stable? Is he breathing? Okay?" "He's stable," she said. "He's talking, but he's disoriented, and he keeps asking for you, and I think it would help him a great deal if you could come get him yourself rather than us sending the ambulance. Sometimes with the confusion, familiar faces do more than sirens." I told her I was coming. I hung up and stood there for exactly the length of time it takes to remember your own life. My truck, the one I've had for 11 years, the one with 210,000 miles on it, had thrown a belt 3 days earlier and was sitting up on the lift at Hutchins Automotive on Baldwin Street, waiting on a part that wasn't due in until Thursday. I didn't have a vehicle. What I had was a wife upstairs and a driveway and her car in it. My wife's name is Carol. We'd been married 14 years, her second marriage, my second as well. Both of us meeting later in life after our first marriages ended the ordinary, exhausting ways that marriages end. Her car, a navy blue Buick Enclave, sat in our driveway with a full tank because Carol was a woman who never let her gas gauge dip below half, the same way she never let a dish sit in the sink or a bill go unpaid a day past its due date. Everything about Carol was managed, controlled. I used to call it responsible. That morning I would learn a different word for it. I went up the stairs 2 at a time. Carol. Nothing. She was in the bathroom, blow-drying her hair for work, the machine roaring loud enough to swallow a freight train. I knocked on the door frame. Carol. She clicked it off. "What?" Not "what's wrong," not "are you okay?" Just what? The way you'd say it to a telemarketer who called during dinner. My dad fell. He's disoriented. They think it might be his hip or worse, and I need to go get him and take him to St. Vincent's. I need to borrow your car. Mine's still at the shop. She didn't answer right away. She set the blow dryer down on the counter, very deliberately, the way she does everything, and looked at herself in the mirror for one more second before she looked at me. Today, Frank? Today of all days? I didn't understand the question. What do you mean, today of all days? My father might have broken his hip, Carol. I have the closing on the Ashford property at 10. You know that. I've told you about this for 2 weeks. Every agent in the county is going to be there, and I cannot be late, and I cannot show up looking like I drove out of my own driveway in a panic. I want to be clear about something. Carol sells real estate. She's very good at it. I have never once, in 14 years, asked her to move a closing, cancel a showing, reschedule an open house. Not once. I understood her job mattered to her. What I didn't understand, standing in that bathroom doorway at 6:20 in the morning, was that her job mattered more to her than my father's hip. Carol, I said, and I heard my own voice come out lower than I meant it to. He's 86 years old. He fell. He doesn't know what day it is right now. I need the car for 2 hours, maybe 3. She crossed her arms. Not out of anger, I realized later out of finality. The way you cross your arms when a decision is already made and you're just waiting for the other person to catch up to it. Call a cab, she said. Or call the facility back and tell them to send the ambulance like they're supposed to. That's what ambulances are for, Frank. He doesn't want the ambulance. He's scared and confused, and he's asking for me, specifically, by name. This is not the same as a scraped knee, Carol. This is my father, and this is my career, she said. And something in the way she said my landed like a slap, because in 14 years of marriage, I don't think I'd ever heard her draw that particular line so clearly, so surgically, between what was hers and what was, apparently, only mine to worry about. He'll be fine at the hospital either way. They'll take care of him. That's their job. My job is mine to protect, and nobody else is going to protect it for me. I stood there, just stood there, in my socks, on the cold tile at the top of the stairs, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm hits, when even the birds know enough to stop singing. Figure it out, she said, not unkindly, not even with any particular heat behind it, which somehow made it worse. That's what people say when they've already stopped caring about the outcome. She picked the blow dryer back up. The door didn't slam. She just turned back to the mirror like I'd told her we were low on coffee filters, and the roar of the dryer swallowed whatever I might have said next, so I didn't say it. I stood there for maybe 4 seconds. Then I went downstairs and I called my neighbor, Gus Ferraro. Gus lived 2 doors down, 74 years old, a retired postal carrier who still walked 2 miles every morning before 6 a.m., regardless of weather, snow, sleet, or his own arthritis, because 40 years of delivering mail teaches a man that the day starts when the day starts, whether you feel like it or not. Gus had known my father for almost 20 years. They played cribbage every other Thursday at the VFW hall. He picked up on the first ring. Frank, everything all right? Gus, I need a favor. Dad fell at Willow Creek. I need a ride over there and then to St. Vincent's. My truck's still at Hutchins. There was no pause. No hesitation, no throat clearing, no negotiation. Give me 3 minutes, he said. I'm already got my boots on. That was it. No conditions. No mention of his own morning, his own plans, whatever he had going on in his own life that Tuesday. Just 3 minutes, and boots already on, like the answer had been sitting there waiting for the question to arrive. I called Willow Creek back and told them I was coming, and to tell my father to sit tight, that I was on my way, that he didn't need to do anything but wait. Denise told me he'd calmed down some since the first call, that the confusion seemed to be easing, but that the pain in his hip hadn't. I told her, tell him I'm coming. Tell him Frank's coming. She said she would. Gus pulled into my driveway in his old maroon Ford Ranger 2 minutes and 40 seconds after we hung up. I know because I was standing on the porch watching the clock on my phone, the way you watch a clock when you need something concrete to hold on to. We didn't talk much on the way to Willow Creek. Gus had the radio on low, some AM station playing farm reports and weather, And he just drove, steady hands on the wheel, not asking me anything. Because some men understand that silence, at the right moment, is its own kind of company. We got to Willow Creek, and Dad was in the lobby in a wheelchair, a blanket over his knees, looking smaller than I remembered him looking even a week before. His face lit up when he saw me come through the doors. The particular way a man's face lights up when he's been scared and doesn't want to admit it. "There he is," Dad said, his voice thin, not his usual gravel. "Frank, I told them you'd come." "I'm here, Dad." I knelt down next to the wheelchair. "How's the hip?" "Hurts like the devil," he said, and managed something close to a smile. "But my head's clear now. I think I just hit it funny when I went down. Scared these nice people half to death." "You scared me half to death," I said. Gus drove us to St. Vincent's, sat in the waiting room the entire time without complaint, without checking his watch, without once asking how much longer this was going to take. We checked in at the ER at 7:40. A nurse named Priscilla, gray-haired, brisk, the kind of woman who'd clearly seen every version of this exact morning 1,000 times before, got my father into a room within 20 minutes. The doctor, a young man named Dr. Osei, ordered x-rays on the hip and a scan to rule out anything serious with his head from the fall. I sat in that waiting room for 2 hours and 35 minutes. I remember it exactly because I watched every one of those minutes pass on a wall clock shaped like a sunflower, the kind of decoration somebody chose to make a hospital waiting room feel less like a hospital waiting room, and it did not work. I drank coffee from a vending machine that tasted like scorched cardboard and didn't complain, because complaining about coffee felt like the smallest possible problem I could have that morning. Carol did not call. Not once. Not a single text. I checked my phone every few minutes. The way you check a phone when part of you is hoping to be wrong about someone. At 10:15, Dr. Osei came out to find me. His face had that careful, measured look doctors get when the news isn't catastrophic but isn't nothing either. "Mr. Delacroix, your father has a hairline fracture in his hip. Not a full break, thankfully, and no surgery needed, but it's going to require several weeks of careful movement, likely a walker, and we want to keep him overnight for observation given his age and the disorientation this morning." "Is he going to be okay?" "He's going to be okay. He's tough. He's already asking the nurses when he can go home and start walking again." "That's him," I said, and I actually laughed. The first easy breath I'd taken in 4 hours. I stayed with my father the rest of that day. We watched an old Western on the little television bolted to the wall, and he beat me twice at a word-guessing game he invented on the spot, using nothing but the names of hospital equipment and old ball players. Because that was Dad sharper at 86 with a fractured hip than most men are at 50, with nothing wrong with them at all. Around 3 o'clock, he took my hand, and his voice changed, the thin morning voice completely gone, replaced by something older and steadier, the voice he used when he meant something. "Frank," he said, "Carol didn't come. It wasn't a question." I didn't answer right away. "She had the closing this morning," I finally said. "On the Ashford property. Just my name, Frank." That's all he said. Just Frank, like the single syllable carried everything else he wasn't going to say out loud. He looked toward the window, where the gray Pennsylvania sky sat low over the parking lot, and something moved across his face, quiet and deliberate. The specific look of a man who has just finished doing some arithmetic he didn't enjoy doing. I kissed his forehead before I left that evening. Gus drove me home in comfortable silence. And somewhere on Route 30, watching the bare February trees slide past the windshield, I realized I wasn't furious at Carol. I was something past furious. I was finished. If you've stuck with me this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you'd think to a guy telling stories from his kitchen table at night. Now, let me tell you what happened the next morning, because that's when things really started moving. Wednesday, 6:40 in the morning, and I was awake before the alarm, lying on my side of the bed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling I'd been meaning to patch for 2 years, thinking about my father's voice saying just my name, like it was the whole verdict. Carol was still asleep beside me, breathing slow and even, completely unbothered, the way she'd been unbothered by everything since yesterday morning. I got up quiet, went down to the kitchen, made coffee the way I like it, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and didn't feel 1 ounce of guilt about the noise the grinder made. She'd chosen a closing over my father's hip. She could survive a coffee grinder. I was on my second cup when I heard her on the stairs. She came into the kitchen, already dressed for another showing, glanced at me, then at the coffee maker, then back at me. "How's your dad?" she asked, like she was asking about the weather in a city she'd never visited. "Hairline fracture in the hip. They're keeping him another night." "That's good," she said. "That he's stable, I mean." There was a silence, then, the specific kind that 14 years of marriage teaches you to recognize, the kind that's waiting for somebody to bring something up. "How was the closing?" I asked. She blinked, just once, but I caught it. "It went fine," she said carefully. "Frank, I want you to understand. Yesterday was an incredibly important morning for me professionally. I've been building toward that closing for 3 months." I let the words sit there in the space between us. "My father hit his head and didn't know what day it was, and you were signing paperwork on a kitchen island in a house you don't even live in," I said. "But sure, important morning." "Frank." I stood up, rinsed my mug, set it in the rack. "I heard you yesterday," I said, "at the top of the stairs. I heard every word of it." "I'm not trying to relitigate it," she said. "I'm trying to explain my side." "I know," I said. I picked up my keys, my jacket, the spare key to Gus's truck he'd insisted I hang on to for the week since my own truck was still waiting on parts. "I'm going to go see my father." Gus drove me again, same easy silence, same old country station low on the radio. We got to St. Vincent's around 8:30, and he told me he'd wait in the lobby, and when I told him he didn't have to, he just looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "Frank, I'll be here." Some people don't argue with you about showing up. They just show up. Write that down somewhere you won't lose it. My father was sitting up in bed when I walked in, color back in his face, a crossword puzzle folded open in his lap, reading glasses pushed down his nose. "7 letters," he said, before I'd even said good morning. "Clue is act of disloyalty." I stood in the doorway and stared at him. "Dad." "For the crossword, Frank," he said, with the straightest face God ever gave a man. I laughed so hard the nurse looked in from the hallway to check I wasn't choking. We sat together a good while after that, easy and quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists between two people who've spent a whole lifetime not needing to fill it. Then he closed the crossword book, set it on the tray table, and folded his hands. "I want to call Denny this morning," he said. Denny Callahan, Esquire, had handled my father's affairs for going on 25 years, a sharp, unhurried man who'd drawn up Dad's will back when I was still in my 30s, and Mom had only been gone a few years. "Dad," I said carefully, "you don't have to do anything today. You just had a fall." "Walter Francis Delacroix does not need a permission slip from his son," he said, full name and all, something I hadn't heard since I was 17 and came home 40 minutes past curfew, smelling like somebody else's cigarettes. "I've been thinking since last night, and I've made up my mind, and I'd like you to sit there and not say a word while I make this phone call. Can you do that for your old man?" "Yes, sir," I said, and meant it. "I've worked my whole life," he said, quieter now, more to himself than to me. "Your mother and I scraped together every nickel we had so that what we built would mean something, so it would land somewhere that mattered." He looked at me over his glasses. "It goes to people who show up, Frank. That's all it's ever been about." I didn't say anything. "Carol didn't show up yesterday," he said. "Not just yesterday. I thought about the winter I had my knee replaced and needed rides to therapy 3 times a week for 6 weeks, and she managed exactly one of those rides. I thought about your mother's memorial bench dedication 2 years ago, when Carol had a headache. I thought about yesterday morning, when I was scared and confused and asking for my son, and she was worried about a signature on a piece of paper. Every one of those examples landed slow and heavy, like stones dropped into still water, because he was right, and I'd spent years quietly making excuses for exactly this pattern without ever calling it what it was. "I'm not angry," he said, and the remarkable thing was, he wasn't. His voice was as calm and level as I'd ever heard it. "I'm just done pretending I don't see it." He reached for the hospital phone, dialed the number from memory, because Walter Delacroix never trusted a phone to remember anything for him. Denny picked up on the second ring. "Walter," Denny said, warmth immediately in his voice. "To what do I owe this?" I'm at St. Vincent's, actually, Dad said. Fell and cracked my hip. Nothing you need to worry about. Denny's voice sharpened with concern, and Dad waved it off the way only he could, and then he said the thing I knew was coming the moment he'd asked for the phone. Denny, I need you to come see me today, if you can manage it. I want to revisit the will. I've got some very specific changes in mind, and I'd like to get them done properly and get them done soon. There was a pause on Denny's end, a professional pause, absorbing rather than stalling, and then, of course, Walter, I can be there by 2. Perfect, Dad said. My son will be in the room. He hung up, set the phone down, and picked the crossword back up like he hadn't just rearranged the entire architecture of his estate from a hospital bed with a cracked hip. Dad, I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to come out, you don't have to do this on my account. I'm not doing it for you, Frank, he said, without looking up from the puzzle. I'm doing it because I've earned the right to decide where a lifetime of work goes, and I've decided. Any questions? I had roughly 40. I asked exactly none of them. Good, he said. Now, go find me something from that cafeteria that doesn't taste like a punishment. Denny Callahan arrived at St. Vincent's at 2 o'clock sharp, gray suit, leather folder, a handshake firm enough to remind you he'd grown up on a dairy farm before he ever went to law school. He sat with my father for the better part of an hour. I sat in the corner and said nothing, because some conversations deserve their privacy even when you're in the room for them. I won't tell you every detail of what got decided in that hour, because it isn't really mine to spread around like gossip. But I'll tell you this much. By the time Denny closed that leather folder, the assumptions Carol Delacroix had apparently been quietly making for 14 years about what was coming to her had been completely, legally, and irreversibly rewritten. The house on Larkspur Lane that my parents built with their own hands in 1974. The small stock portfolio my father had built one careful contribution at a time since Eisenhower was president. My mother's wedding ring, which Dad had kept in a cedar box in his nightstand for 30 years, waiting for whichever grandchild eventually needed it. His 1963 Ford Fairlane, which still ran, which still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco on warm days when you opened the garage. And $4,000, earmarked specifically for the volunteer fire company in his hometown, because Walter Delacroix had run into 2 burning buildings in his life before he turned 18, and he never forgot what those men had given him. Carol's name appeared exactly 0 times in that document. When Denny stood to leave, he shook my hand at the door and glanced back at my father, already absorbed in his crossword again, unbothered, entirely himself. Your dad, he said quietly, is one of the sharpest men I've worked with in 25 years of practice. I know, I said. I've always known. Gus drove me home that evening, and when he asked if I was all right, I told him everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be, and he nodded, the way old friends nod when they don't need the whole explanation to understand the shape of it. Thursday morning, my truck was finally ready at Hutchins, new belt installed, and I was standing at the counter signing the invoice when my phone buzzed. Carol. I let it ring, not out of some grand strategy. I just didn't have anything worth saying yet. I drove my own truck out to Willow Creek to bring my father home, because by Thursday he'd been discharged with a walker and strict instructions about weight-bearing, and I intended to be the one who brought him back through his own front door. My phone buzzed again in the cup holder. Carol. Then again. Then a third time. Then a fourth. By the time I pulled into the visitor lot at St. Vincent's, because they'd kept him one final night for observation before releasing him, there were 11 missed calls sitting on that screen, all from her, all within about 40 minutes. Something's happening, I thought, and I wasn't wrong. My father was ready when I got there, sitting up in a wheelchair per hospital policy, blanket over his knees, already arguing with the nurse about walking to the truck himself. I had a cracked hip, he told her, not a personality transplant. She laughed, the genuine kind, and told him to behave himself, and he told her not to hold her breath. I got him settled in the passenger seat of my truck, Walker folded in the bed, and drove him home to Larkspur Lane, the same white farmhouse with green shutters I'd learned to ride a bike in front of 60 years earlier. I got him inside, made him tea, checked his new prescriptions one at a time, read every label out loud while he sat at his kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug. Frank, he said, watching me from across that table. Sit down a minute. I sat. He reached across and put both his hands over mine. The same hands that had shingled that roof 3 times, that had packed my school lunches after Mom died, that had held mine in the front seat of an ambulance the day we buried her. What I did with the will, he said. I didn't do it to punish Carol. I know, Dad. I did it because it was right. Your mother and I built something, and it belongs to somebody who understands what building something together actually means. He squeezed my hand once. You understand that. I did. I understood it clean through to the bone. And Frank, he said, his voice dropping, more deliberate now, not softer, I need you to think hard about your own life. Not the money. None of that. I need you to think about whether you're happy. Whether you're loved the way a man deserves to be loved after everything you've given. He looked at me, a long moment. Because you've been showing up alone for a long time now, son. And a man who shows up the way you do deserves somebody standing next to him when he does. The kitchen was completely still. Somewhere outside a dog barked twice down Larkspur Lane and went quiet again. Everything he said was true, every word of it, and my throat went tight and my eyes burned at the corners, and I didn't look away from him. I know, Dad, I said, and my voice came out rough and honest. He nodded once, patted my hand twice, and released it. Good, he said. Now, are you going to answer that phone? Or are we going to sit here and watch it rattle itself off the table? My phone was buzzing again between us. Carol, call number 17. Not yet, I said. Not yet, he repeated quietly, like he was testing the patience of it in his mouth, and the corner of his mouth twitched with something that might have been pride. I left Larkspur Lane around 1 that afternoon and drove home to Birchwood Court, parked behind Carol's enclave, and sat in my truck a full minute before I went inside. 26 missed calls by then. 26. She was in the living room when I walked through the door, still in her blazer from whatever showing she'd had that morning, both hands wrapped around her phone like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Her eyes were red-rimmed, sleepless, and something in her face had cracked in a way I hadn't seen in 14 years of marriage. Frank, she said, standing up fast. I've been trying to reach you all day. I know, I said. I hung my keys on the hook by the door. Did you know, she said, her voice catching. About the will. Did you know he was going to do that? No, I said, turning to face her fully. I found out the same time you did, sitting right there in that hospital room. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a second, trying to compose herself, and when she spoke again, it was quieter, more controlled. But underneath it was real fear, the specific kind that shows up right when consequences finally catch up to a person. Denny's office called to confirm the filing, she said. Frank, do you understand what that means? Everything we assumed was, I understand exactly what it means, I said. Calm, steadier than I'd sounded in years. Then talk to him, she said. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him I would have come if I'd fully understood how serious it was. I took one step toward her. Not angry. Just present. Fully present. In a way I hadn't been in a long, long time. Because I finally had nothing left in me that needed protecting. You had a closing, I said, while my father sat confused and scared in a wheelchair asking for me by name, while I sat in a waiting room under fluorescent lights drinking coffee that tasted like a mistake, while Gus Ferraro sat in that same waiting room for hours without complaint, because that's just what people do for each other. The color drained slowly out of her face. My father made his decision, I said, the same way you made yours, clearly, deliberately, without asking anybody's permission. Frank, please. He's 86 years old. He's not going to hold this against. He's not holding anything against anybody, I said. He just finally stopped expecting people to show up who'd already shown him, over and over, that they wouldn't. The room went completely quiet. Carol looked at me, really looked, maybe for the first time in years, and something moved across her face that wasn't just fear anymore. It was the specific look of somebody finally understanding the full size of what they'd lost. Not the inheritance, not the house or the ring or the old Fairlane. Me. She understood, standing there in that living room, that she'd lost me, and that the man in front of her with his keys already in his hand wasn't the same man who'd stood at the top of those stairs 2 mornings earlier, still hoping she'd say yes. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at it, then back up at me, something that might have been hope flickering across her face. I looked at her for exactly 1 second, and felt the last thread of something I'd been holding on to for 14 years finally go slack. Not with anger, with something quieter. With relief. "I'm going to go check on my father," I said. I opened the front door, and the cold February air hit me clean and honest, and I turned back one final time. Carol was standing in the middle of that living room, phone still buzzing in her hand, my father's name likely lighting up the screen, and 26 calls worth of consequence written across every line of her face. "You should probably answer that," I said. I closed the door behind me and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since sometime around 6:15 Tuesday morning. I stood on that porch a minute, the cold, clean air settling into my chest, and something in me finally went quiet in the good way, not the scared way. Clarity. Not rage. Not bitterness. Just the plain, unmistakable clarity of a man who'd spent 14 years mistaking endurance for partnership, and had finally seen the difference laid bare in the space of 3 ordinary days. I hadn't been married for 14 years. I'd been managing a marriage for 14 years, the way you manage a leak you've decided isn't worth the cost of fixing properly. There's a difference, and it took my father, at 86, with a cracked hip and a crossword puzzle in his lap, to show it to me plainly. I walked to my truck, started the engine, let the radio come up low, something old, something Dad used to hum on Saturday mornings while he worked on that Fairlane in the garage, and I drove back toward Larkspur Lane, toward the only person that week who'd never once made me wonder where I stood with him. Showing up isn't complicated. It never was. It's just rare enough that when somebody actually does it, you remember it for the rest of your life, and when somebody doesn't, eventually, you remember that too. If this story meant something to you tonight, stay a while longer, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next time I've got something worth telling.